Okay. We're okay. Let's open in a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for this day. We pray that you'll bless our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, I'm going to use a clever line that I heard on a podcast that I do occasionally with David Fiorazzo on Stand Up for the Truth out of Q90 FM in Wisconsin, standupforthetruth.com also. And he said this, it was either he or his guest this week said, normal isn't coming back, but Jesus is. So we need to take comfort in that fact that I've said a number of times that some point in 2021, and I think we're already past that point, people would say, boy, could we just go back to the good old days of 2020? So I think we've reached that point. Here again, here's some of the channels that we're on. Again, we're working to get a little bit of our own platform and app. We will continue to stream on YouTube and Facebook as long as we can. You can also get us on Vimeo and some of these other channels. None of them work quite as well, in my opinion, as YouTube. Like Rumble's even starting to run ads now on their videos, and they got to pay for this thing. I understand that. And and I still am on Facebook and Twitter. I do have an account on, there's a new social media app called Getter, Gettr. I'm John Haller, 54. I've really thought about that username for a long time. Got really creative with it. We talk each week about the convergence of events, and we see these things happening. It's a troubled world. We seem to be getting closer and closer to the end. So look, there are a number of passages that I could cite. We could cite 2 Timothy chapter 3. People will be given over to myths, in 2 Thessalonians 2. Men will depart from the faith, also in 1 Timothy chapter 4. And we see these things happening in the church, and then we also see sort of natural things happening that seem to be unusual in the sense that they seem to all be happening at the same time. So there's a big heat wave. In fact, this is an article from a week ago about in British Columbia, which the ocean in British Columbia is pretty cold. But because of the heat wave, it heated up the rocks, and a lot of these starfish and mussels and that type of thing, there were just like billions and billions of them that died in the heat wave. Well, when that happens, it has a carry-on effect because there are sea creatures that eat mussels or starfish or that type of thing, and then their food is gone, so they have to look elsewhere or they die. Well, then they die. It can cause a big stink, a big stinking mess, so to speak. And there's reports that, here's just a couple pages from the New York Times about, it says this, it's kind of an interesting story. It's titled, "No One is Safe, Extreme Weather Batters the Wealthy World." Because, they're the New York Times. They always got to get the class thing in there and the privilege thing in there. This is a wildfire that took place in Lytton, Lytton, British Columbia, a little over a week ago. It just came through and pretty much devastated the whole town in British Columbia. There's some thinking that it might be related to the fires that were set on the Canadian churches, but that's still under investigation, so don't say that I'm making that connection yet. But it's a possibility. I think the list I saw now is there have been 45 churches in Canada that have been destroyed, and really, Prime Minister Baby Trudeau has not really said anything about it much. Just that, well, it's understandable that people would do that. So because of this alleged abuse that took place in indigenous children taken from indigenous parents and placed in schools, and there are graves around these churches and that some of the churches, but they're burning a lot of other churches, and they're burning indigenous churches. And the indigenous people are saying, don't burn our church. This is a picture from Siberia, again from the New York Times. as frozen land burns, Siberia fears if we don't have the forest, we don't have life. And they're concerned about that. There's another heat dome coming, particularly from the Pacific Northwest through southern Canada, that's going to be bad over the next week. It's affecting crops. I've seen, like in Washington, parts of Washington that grow some specialized wheat, there's just an incredibly high protein content in the wheat because the vegetable part is just sort of drying up and blowing away. This eventually has an impact. We have drought in California. Some places the production is way down. I think California produces about 90% of the almonds. And California is always pretty dry, but it seems to be exceptionally dry this year. Plus, they keep letting the water out of the dams to protect the delta smelt. So that's why a lot of these dams have gone down. But in addition to that, there's drought, and Lake Mead is down to about approaching 30% of capacity, along with a lot of other reservoirs. So it's a major problem. Now, the flip side of drought is floods. And in Germany this week, they had historic floods. There are over, I think, 200 people were killed, and there are over 1,000 missing. As these floods along the Rhine River, both in Germany and Netherlands, came and just really took out everything. I mean, look at this picture that you'll see everywhere. Here's a train in one of the towns in Germany. Here's another picture of a town where the river came raging through, and you can see the devastation left behind. So just an idea where this is. It's in the Rhine River area, what's called the Rhineland, also extending over into Netherlands. You can see pictures of entire fields in the Netherlands underwater. And it's not that that's that unusual. We've had a tremendous amount of rain around here, as you know, but these are floods that they've not seen for well over 100 years. And when you couple it with everything else that's going on, it does seem to be pretty epic. Well, the EU has come out this week and said that they presented a series of ambitious measures to adapt the legislation to new climate targets for 2030 and 2050. So it used to be everything was going to happen in 2030. Now they moved it out to 2050. But listen to some of these targets. Flagship measure: the end of the sale of thermal vehicles, gas-powered vehicles, in 2035. The car of the future is just electric, and the future is surely closer than we think. Manufacturers will have to reduce emissions from their new car fleet by 60% by 2030, which logically will push for a significant increase in the share of electric vehicles, which counted for only about 11% of sales last year. Now, I did mention a car I saw in Colorado a couple years ago, and I got the license plate wrong. I went back and looked up the picture. The license plate on a Tesla, it didn't say zero carbs, because some people say, well, maybe that's a diet doctor. That's why he's rich and can afford a Tesla, which is a really good point. But that wasn't the correct license plate. It was I emit zero. Now, listen, this is just a fantasy. The person probably lived in Boulder. I mean, that's kind of a left-wing place where they don't think too well through things. And thinks that, well, I got a Tesla, so I don't emit, there's no carbon emissions associated with my car. Yeah, you plug it into where do you think the electricity comes to that plug that you plug in every night? So this is an article in this morning's New York Times about these ambitious 9-year plan to fight climate change. And what you see, all these articles about weather, everything was about climate change. We've got man-made climate change. We got to control this, and nobody knows what to do. Got to cut carbon emissions, unless you're Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson, who can fly in a carbon-emitting plane to low space for 15 minutes that burns up a lot more, puts out a lot more CO2, I guess, than a lot of cars would. or plants would. Anyway, it's all crazy. And this is a good editorial today, opinion piece in the Times of London that says, zero carbon, zero COVID, zero chance. And I think this guy's probably got it right. It'll always be something else. They'll always push it out. And it's always interesting. They push these things out to 2030, now 2050, now later. I mean, by the time you get to 2050, you're pretty much outside of my expected life. So I'm not really that concerned whether you meet your targets or not, frankly, because I'm not going to be here. And I don't think you should be irresponsible, but for crying out loud, people. And here's the problem. Well, you'll see, I think I have a graph here in just a moment that will sort of show you part of the problem, why this is unachievable, and it's just a bunch of power-hungry people that want to get control of things, to do things. Now, this is an article. It was published a number of places. This one came from Interesting Engineering. Notice it was Interesting Engineering, not Interesting Engineers. We used to joke, my wife worked at an engineering firm, and we used to joke that you'd go to it was an architectural engineering firm. You'd go to a party, and you would tell the funniest story ever. And the architects would be on the floor laughing. And all the engineers are standing around doing this. You know, when I think about it, that is funny. So, anyway, I'm being a little bit exaggerating there. So, we actually had a very good friend who was an engineer, and he had a very normal sense of humor. But here's what this article says. MIT predicted the collapse of today's society in 1972, and we're right on track. So a researcher, speaker from KPMG, accounting firm, looked at this book that was published back called The Limits to Growth, published for the Club of Rome. That might ring a bell with some of you, back in 1972. You can actually get on archive.org and check it out and read it if you want. Essentially what it said was they were looking at what's going to happen in the future with regard to this. And there's a lot of people who, I wouldn't call them prophets, they sort of prognosticate about what's going to happen in the future. They sort of prediction, they're futurists. So I wouldn't give them the category of prophet. But they looked, technocrats, if you will, they looked at what was going on in the world, the increase in population growth. And so since 1972, the world population has more than doubled. Well, that means there's twice as many people that need water and food. There's twice as many people that need energy. There's twice as many people that need places to live. And those places to live need to be built out of materials like wood or something like that needs to be cut down and then transported to places. So there's a whole cycle. And they looked at all of these things, the demand for food, and they thought that, for lack of a better term, society would pretty much collapse and cease to function normally around 2040. That's kind of interesting because you can make the case for, if you look at 6 days of 1,000 years in Bible prophecy and world history, we're sort of getting close to that period of time. And the people that wrote about what's going to happen in the end, they were prophets. They were inspired by God. And the advantage we have is that they wrote a lot longer ago than 1972. But a lot of the things that we see are starting to come true. So here she writes this article. Her name is Gaia Harrington. She writes this article. Here is her main conclusion. And I only cite this because I think it's interesting when secular people are kind of coming to the same conclusion and analyses that people who teach on Bible prophecy do, because Bible prophecy will unfold in a real world. It's not going to unfold in something that nobody's experienced. There will be people who will experience it actually unfolding and being fulfilled at some point. And so she says here, given the unappealing prospect of collapse, I was curious to see which scenarios were aligning most closely with empirical data today. After all, the book that featured this world model was a bestseller in the 1970s, and by now we'd have several decades of empirical data which would make a comparison meaningful. But to my surprise, I could not find recent attempts for this, so I decided to do it for myself. So she's internal audit and enterprise risk with KPMG. So there were three scenarios that they looked at. One was what they called a stabilized world, which meant that people worked on things and they got better. But do you see so you see 2100 and you see a lot of these things declining. You see industrial input that sort of peaks around this 2040 date, pollution as well, and then everything kind of goes down. Population levels off, resources drop pretty dramatically, have been dropping pretty dramatically since the mid-1900s. Food will kind of go up and down. I don't know how they get it to go back up, but so she says this. Guy Harrington told Motherboard that in the MIT World 3 models, this is the three models, collapse does not mean that humanity will cease to exist, but rather that economic and industrial growth will stop and then decline, which will hurt food production and standards of living. In terms of timing, the BAU2 model, the scenario, shows a steep decline to set in around 2040. So the first model is this. This is a comprehensive technology. Economic decline still sets in around this date with a range of possible negative consequences, but this does not lead to societal collapse. Then there is, I have got the titles mixed up. There's a stabilized world. She says this, unfortunately, the scenario which was the least closest fit to the latest empirical data happens to be the most optimistic pathway, known as stabilized world, in which civilization follows a sustainable path and experiences the smallest declines in economic growth based on a combination of technological innovation and widespread investment in public health and education. So I wanted to learn a little bit more. So there are these scenarios that just don't look very good in the future. They say society will not completely collapse or cease to exist, but that it will be very different because of demands. And remember, there's a lot of places in the world where the population is still growing very rapidly. I've cited you studies that by 2050, certainly by 2100, they're predicting that there are a number of cities in Africa, some of which you've never heard, will have populations of over 100 million in one city. This is what the apocalypse looks like. This is what the end times looks like. Now, I went to her LinkedIn account and found out she said this, look, we're all concerned about climate change and we've got all these goals and targets and all this thing. And she said, why is the coronavirus response more dramatic than that against climate change? Because sometimes velocity triggers the human psyche more than total impact. So, in other words, the coronavirus thing came on us very quickly, and that's why it got everybody's attention, but climate change is just as bad, she's saying. And she has this interesting chart here about total CO2 emissions by world region, and you can see starting in 1950 to 2000, look at the growth in CO2 emissions. Now, I don't really dispute that data, and you can see here the United States has actually gone down a little from the peak. China's in a huge spike, Asia and the Pacific, and really Africa is just sort of a little bit in there, not using that many resources like India. They've gone up quite a bit, but they still have small emissions, and they want prosperity there. So all of these climate models like the EU, it's like, we'll have electric cars. We're not giving up cars or trains or planes, but we expect everybody else to kind of ratchet back their desires for those things. And that's not going to work. And the question I had is, would she be one who would support, like some people, lockdowns to fight climate change? I mean, I've showed you those charts recently where they say, okay, you know, you get, 4 pounds of meat per year. I'm not in compliance with that, by the way. And I'm not going to be in compliance with that if I have any choice in the matter. You can take one flight every few years. I mean, it's not going to happen, but there are going to be people that want to get power that they're going to use this. Speaking of power, here is what the president, so this was kind of interesting. The president got some weak-kneed Republicans to sign on to his infrastructure plan at $600 billion. And they agreed. Now what are they doing? Oh, it's $3.5 trillion, guys. And we're going to ram it through with our majority in Congress. And I think the one Democratic senator who was holding out is caving. There's been, the other thing that there's been quite a bit this week is just everywhere you look, there's societal disruption. There were protests in Cuba, people claiming that they were lacking freedom. They were under economic oppression. Of course, now when it got to be explained by people at Black Lives Matter and the White House, and I'm not repeating myself when I say that, they said, well, no, it's just because they couldn't get access to health care and vaccines. That's why they were protesting. It had nothing to do with anything else. And certainly we hope they do well living in a failed system. And here's an article from Financial Times. There's no food, money, or work. When people don't have food, money, or work, they go to the streets and they protest. And I think this is something you need to expect will happen more in the future. Cuba's response to that was to pull the plug on the internet where people were getting together to say we're going to be to this protest. And there were some crackdowns. Not a lot of media, of course, but I've heard that in some places the crackdown has been just brutal. So that immediately leads to the question is, we have this policy in the United States, at least have this policy in the United States, that when people are under political oppression, they should just immigrate to the United States, whether they have approved immigration or not, right? This is the whole thing that's going on. At one point, what's the number, up to 1.6, 1.8 million people coming through the border this year? They're putting them on buses and planes and sending them to other parts of the country. And they're usually parts of the country that voted a certain way in the last election, that the people in power want to flip the ability to pick up those states. So I've heard of planes landing in Tennessee and Florida and Georgia to flip the demographic things because they figure the people coming in through the southern border of Mexico will be more likely to vote for Democrats than Republicans. So there's a concerted effort to flip the demographics of the United States, at least certain states. They don't have to worry about California. I mean, California seems to be gone, although a man I know, Larry Elder, is running for, well, if the recall happens, he'll run for governor in California, and he would be an excellent choice. Anyway. That's just my personal opinion. Usual disclaimers that opinions are mine, not those of blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. So you would think, okay, well, if fleeing oppression and persecution is the standard for people immigrating to the United States, we should welcome these people from Cuba. Well, why not? Well, here's what I don't know who this guy is. He himself, his family came from Cuba. He himself may have come from Cuba. And so this is what he says about people coming from Cuba. He's with the Department of Homeland Security, I think. Here's what he says.
The Coast Guard, along with our state, local, and federal partners, are monitoring any activity that may indicate increases in unsafe and irregular maritime migration in the Florida Straits, including unpermitted vessel departures from Florida to Cuba.
So maritime migration is bad.
The time is never right to attempt migration by sea. To those who risk their lives doing so, this risk is not worth taking. Allow me to be clear. If you take to the sea, you will not come to the United States. Any migrant intercepted at sea, regardless of their nationality, will not be permitted to enter the United States.
That was, by the way, that inset was my little edit in of people crossing the watery Rio Grande to get into the border, which is okay. Because we don't want people from Cuba, because why? Well, Florida, is particularly the Cuban community in Miami, is heavily Republican. So we don't want any more of those people. But do you see this sort of Orwellian, doublespeak, fake world we live in? Like, does this guy think we can't see right through this? I mean, really? Is he that? Mr. Cuban immigrant himself or family was Cuban immigrants? He can't see this? And what, let me say it this way. At the end today, I'm going to talk about a couple of hollowed out countries that are major problems, Lebanon and Syria. The other major problem we have is, in my opinion, is hollowed out souls they've lost their humanity. And we're seeing that on an epic scale. This was Emmanuel Macron, the leader in France, who came out and essentially said, look, guys, we're going to put in place a vaccine passport, Vax Pass, they call it. If you don't have that, or you don't have a negative or a COVID antibody positive, you're positive for COVID antibodies, you're not going to be able to go to restaurants, bars, public places, schools, entertainment, and sports facilities. And so here he was making this announcement the other day in Paris. In his, I guess, technocratic thing. They have a big mobilization program. They call it the Vax Pass. You're going to have to get that in tracing, and you have to show this. This is what they're putting in place. This is the way they think they should deal with it in France. And I'm just presenting to you what people are saying that are in charge, okay? I'm not giving you my opinion one way or another on it because of obvious reasons. But this is what they're saying. I'm telling you what the people in charge say need to be done to deal with this issue. Israel has had a spike in COVID cases. They're talking about locking everything down again or requiring face masks. UK is supposed to open tomorrow, and there are people really upset with that, say they should not do that. The Japan Tokyo Olympics start this week. They've already had a couple positive cases in the Olympic Village. They've banned spectators. Now they have athletes coming from all over the world. And there was a big editorial in the New York Times this morning that said, well, maybe it's time to reconsider where we should have big public sporting events like this. Why can't we I guess everybody just stay in their basement? The result of what happened in France, though, was this kind of interesting response. In just one day in France, which is a big country, but it's not enormous, they had 2 million people make an appointment to get vaccinated because of what Macron said. Now, there was also big protests. These are protests on the street in Paris against the vaccine, the Vax Pass, or whatever it is they're calling it. They're concerned about it. They've had a taste of freedom, and they want it. They And the restaurateurs in Paris are saying, we're not the police, we're restaurateurs. If you want to enforce this stuff, you come in and do it. We're not doing it. So, but what you see is we see this sort of societal chaos as people on one side, people on the other side, and there's not much middle ground on these things. Here is a doctor who was interviewed on CNN the other night about what she thinks should happen with regard to vaccination.
What we really need to do at this point is to make vaccination the easy choice. It needs to be hard for people to remain unvaccinated. Right now, it's kind of the opposite. It's fine. I mean, it's easy if you're unvaccinated. You can do everything you want to do anyway. But at some point, these mandates by workplaces, by schools, I think it will be important to say, hey, you can opt out, but if you want to opt out, you have to sign these forms. You have to get twice weekly testing. Basically, we need to make getting vaccinated the easy choice. That is what it's going to take for us to actually end the pandemic.
And then former Health and Human Services and Ohio native Kathleen Sebelius was also interviewed on CNN, and this is what her opinion was.
We are in a situation where we have a wildly effective vaccine, multiple choices, lots available, free of charge, and we have folks who are just saying, I won't do it. I think that it's time to say to those folks, it's fine if you don't choose to get vaccinated. You may not come to work. You may not have access to a situation where you're going to put my grandchildren in jeopardy, where you might kill them, where you might put them in a situation where they're going to carry the virus to someone in a high-risk position. That's, I think, the point where we are, is freedom is one thing, but freedom when you harm others, like secondhand smoke and issues that we've dealt with very clearly in the past. You can't drive drunk. You can drink, but you can't drive drunk because you can injure other people. You can't smoke inside of a public place where you can give cancer to someone else in spite of their never having been a smoker. So I think we're reaching that point in the United States where those of us who are vaccinated, I want to take off my mask. I want to be able to live my life with vaccination. And right now, I'm being impinged on by people who say, I don't want to get vaccinated. It's fine, but I want them to maybe have a limitation on where they can go and who they can possibly infect.
Okay, I can hear some comments out there. So that I'm just telling you what they say. So here's what happened. They put in sort of contact tracing on apps in the UK. And here's what happened was, all of a sudden, like within a couple days, they had like 500,000. They have now what they call a pingdemic in the UK, because what happens is if you're exposed to somebody who tests positive for COVID, they run that data back and you get a ping on your phone that you've been exposed or in close contact with somebody who has tested positive for COVID. The problem is it's collapsing in some sectors, it's kind of collapsing the economy. Because people get pinged, what do? They stay home. They don't go to work. Now they don't have any workers. There are already worker shortages everywhere. I mean, do you go any place now that you do not see a help wanted sign? I don't go anywhere. So, well, the only place I don't see it is on government buildings, but that's beside the point. In some places, well, never mind. That would be a political comment. So this is a real thing. Here was an editorial from this morning's. Somebody leaving tomorrow is the day they're supposed to open up, and then they get a ping and they turn around and they trudge back home immediately. And you see the guy next door, he's doing the same thing, and nobody's going anywhere. Well, I'm going to play a few clips of our favorite Minister of Information and Truth, Jen Psaka-Berger, I'll call her today. Improve her name a little bit. I actually have another name for her. I'll show you in just a minute. And she had some press conferences, press briefings this week. I always find this interesting. Here is the likes and dislikes on the White House press briefing. I mean, these are really bad numbers for people. I mean, you can put up bad music videos and you'll get 90% likes to 10% dislikes. But I mean, so here we are, 166 likes to 2,100 dislikes. And this is traumatic for the people in the White House, in the Ministry of Information and Truth in the Biden White House. So one of the people who spoke at the press conference on Thursday was the Surgeon General of the United States, who is an immigrant, by the way, from the UK. And here's what he had to say.
But we are not out of the woods yet. Millions of Americans are still not protected against COVID-19, and we are seeing more infections among those who are unvaccinated. And that's why I want to talk to you today about one of the biggest obstacles that's preventing us from ending this pandemic. Today, I issued a Surgeon General's advisory on the dangers of health misinformation. Surgeon General advisories are reserved for urgent public health threats. And while those threats have often been related to what we eat, drink, and smoke, today we live in a world where misinformation poses an imminent and insidious threat to our nation's health. Health misinformation is false, inaccurate, or misleading information about health, according to the best evidence at the time. And while it often appears innocuous on social media apps, on retail sites, or search engines, the truth is that misinformation takes away our freedom to make informed decisions about our health and the health of our loved ones. During the COVID-19 pandemic, health misinformation has led people to resist wearing masks in high-risk settings. It's led them to turn down proven treatments and to choose not to get vaccinated. This has led to avoidable illnesses and death. Simply put, health information has cost us lives. Now, health misinformation didn't start with COVID-19. What's different now, though, is the speed and scale at which health misinformation is spreading. Modern technology companies have enabled misinformation to poison our information environment with little accountability to their users. They've allowed people who intentionally spread misinformation, what we call disinformation, to have extraordinary reach. They've designed product features, such as like buttons, that reward us for sharing emotionally charged content, not accurate content. And their algorithms tend to give us more of what we click on, pulling us deeper and deeper into a well of misinformation. We are saying we expect more from our technology companies. We're asking them to operate with greater transparency and accountability. We're asking them to monitor misinformation more closely. We're asking them to consistently take action against misinformation super spreaders on their platforms. We're also asking news organizations to proactively address the public's questions without inadvertently giving a platform to health misinformation that can harm their audiences.
Okay, this is Orwellian in the extreme. Here is his actual report that you can download. Here's what it says, is that I'm urging all Americans to help slow the spread of health misinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Okay? The spread of health misinformation is a moral and civic imperative that will require a whole of society effort. And then they have in here, now here's the thing, and we can take action. Can do. We have individuals, educators, health professionals, journalists, technology platforms, researchers, funders and foundations, and governments. We're going to get everybody going. In recent years, the rapidly changing information environment has made it easier for misinformation to spread at an unprecedented speed and scale. And then they have prioritized early detection of misinformation, super spreaders, and repeat offenders. We have to, and then they also talk about improving scientific literacy. Now, this is on July 15th. On July 13th, by the way, the World Economic Forum had a conference, a virtual conference online. They're not meeting yet. And here is the director of CERN saying we need to improve science literacy. That was the title of the seminar. So that was on the 13th. 2 days later, the White House is saying we need to improve scientific and medical literacy. I'm sure there's no connection between the two. I'm just pointing out so you can build a little timeline on your own in your head. So here was the Jen Psuckerberger at the White House. Okay, here we go.
Well, first, we are in regular touch with these social media platforms, and those engagements typically happen through members of our senior staff, but also members of our COVID-19 team. Given, as Dr. Murthy conveyed, this is a big issue of misinformation, specifically on the pandemic. In terms of actions, Alex, that we have taken, or we're working to take, I should say, from the federal government, we've increased disinformation research and tracking within the Surgeon General's office. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation. We're working with doctors and medical professionals to connect to connected medical experts who are popular with their audiences with accurate information and boost trusted content. So we're helping get trusted content out there. We also created the COVID Community Corps to get factual information into the hands of local messengers. And we're also investing, as you all have seen, in the president's, the vice president's, and Dr. Fauci's time in meeting with influencers who also have large reaches to a lot of these target audiences who can spread and share accurate information. You saw an example of that yesterday. I believe that video will be out tomorrow. I think that was your question, Steve, yesterday. I did a full follow-up there. There are also proposed changes that we have made to social media platforms, including Facebook, and those specifically are 4 key steps. One, that they measure and publicly share the impact of misinformation on their platform. Facebook should provide publicly and transparently data on the reach of COVID vaccine misinformation, not just engagement, but the reach of the misinformation and the audience that it's reaching. That will help us ensure we're getting accurate information to people. This should be provided not just to researchers, but to the public, so that the public knows and understands.
Okay, do you get the point? We're contacting Facebook, telling them to take down posts. Now, listen, there's a certain former political office holder in the United States who's got a lawsuit against big tech where he says they're violating my constitutional rights because they've essentially been deputized by the government to do indirectly what the government cannot do directly. His lawyers, his or her lawyers, I'm not going to identify the person, of course, but his or her lawyers are looking at this and saying, that's exactly what we're saying in our lawsuit. Let's get this done. Now, Jen Psuckerberger's model for this seems to be the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who about a year ago said this at a news conference in public, being recorded. Here's what she said.
The most up-to-date information daily. You can trust us as a source of that information. You can also trust the Director General of Health and the Ministry of Health. For that information, do feel free to visit at any time to clarify any rumour you may hear, covid19.govt.nz. Otherwise, dismiss anything else. We will continue to be your single source of truth. We will provide information frequently. We will share everything we can, everything else you see, a grain of salt. And so I really ask people to focus.
The most egregious example of that appears to be this text which originated in Malaysia and has become a viral hoax in Australia and in New Zealand. How irresponsible is it the people that are sharing that news of a lockdown imminent in New Zealand?
Yeah, and look, that's the kind of thing that adds to the anxiety that people feel. So I continue to share the message. New Zealanders must prepare, but do not panic, prepare. And when you see those messages, remember that unless you hear it from us, it is not the truth. And I really...
Okay, so her name is Jacinda, I forget her last name. So I am now going to rename Jen Psaki, Jacinda Police Zuckerberger. So just remind me if I say that. So she did a news conference on Friday because she had to clarify some of these things. And here is what she said. And again, this one had So we'll see how the likes and dislikes, 86 likes and then 1,500 dislikes. Not doing too well there, Jen. This was early on after they were put up. And this is very traumatic for the people in the White House. So here is what she had to say, then some questions that she had, a question that she had. This is going to take about 5 minutes, so, fasten your seatbelt. I want to show you exactly what they're saying. And I'm not even going to really comment on it. Here is straight from the White House press briefing. Here you go.
Well, I think as I noted yesterday, Phil, there are more steps that everyone can take. And I would just note again, this is a responsibility of officials speaking, of course, on behalf of the government. It's a responsibility of members of the media. It's the responsibility of citizens and civic leaders and people who are trusted voices in communities around the country. That has a broad definition. Social media platforms is one of them. And as we know, it is also there are also areas where a lot of people get news and information. Sometimes those are accurate news items reported by some of your outlets or accurate information shared by a neighbor. Sometimes there is information that is not. It is hard to discriminate, as we know. This is not a new issue, but it is an issue that is impacting people's lives. So a couple of the steps that we have, that could be constructive for the public health of the country are providing for Facebook or other platforms to measure and publicly share the impact of misinformation on their platform and the audience it's reaching. Also with the public, with all of you, to create robust enforcement strategies that bridge their properties and provide transparency about rules. You shouldn't be banned from one platform and not others for providing misinformation out there. Taking faster action against harmful posts. As you all know, information travels quite quickly. If it's up there for days and days and days, when people see it, it's hard to put that back in a box. And of course, promoting quality information. Algorithms, I don't know how they work, but they all do know how they work. So those are some of the steps that we think could be constructive for public health, for public information, for public, and the right of the public to know.
So then she was asked some questions by, forget his first name, Ducey from Fox News, Peter Ducey. I don't think she likes him. Her body language is a little bit hostile sometimes when he asks questions. So he had some questions for her to follow up on what she had said about asking social media platforms to take down posts.
And then speaking of misinformation and the announcement from yesterday, for how long has the administration been spying on people's Facebook profiles looking for vaccine misinformation?
Well, that was quite a loaded and inaccurate question, which I would refute.
How?
Well, Peter, first of all, as you know, we're in a regular touch with a range of media outlets.
And we expect that the White House is watching
let me finish.
Fox, but
As we are in regular touch with social media platforms. This is publicly open information, people sharing information online, just as you are all reporting information on your news stations.
But, okay, so these 12 people who you have on a list, 12 individuals, do they know that somebody at the Surgeon General's office is going through their profile?
I'm happy to get you the citation of where that comes from. There's no secret list. I will tell you that these are people who are sharing information on public platforms on Facebook. Information that is traveling is inaccurate. Our biggest concern here, and I frankly think it should be your biggest concern, is the number of people who are dying around the country because they're getting misinformation that is leading them to not take a vaccine.
But
young people, old people, kids, children, a lot of them are being impacted by
the
misinformation.
big concern, though, I think, for a lot of people on Facebook is that now this is Big Brother watching you.
They're more concerned about that than people dying across the country because of a pandemic where misinformation is traveling on social media platforms. That feels unlikely to me. If you have the data to back that up, I'm happy to discuss
and just
it.
About things that are on Facebook, I looked this morning. There are videos of Dr. Fauci from 2020 before anybody had a vaccine, and he is out there saying there's no reason to be walking around with a mask. So is the administration going to contact Facebook and ask them to take that down?
Well, first, I think what Dr. Fauci has said himself, who's been quite public out there, is that science evolves, information evolves, and we make that available in a public way to the American people.
Exactly.
I have never seen any data to suggest that the vaccines cause infertility. That is information that is irresponsibly traveling. Okay,
Just one more. Sorry, excuse me, just one more. Okay, about the science evolving. Facebook used to block people from posting that COVID may have originated for a lab. That is something this president now admits is a possibility. So, is there any concern that things you're trying to block or have taken down might someday turn out to be?
We don't take anything down. We don't block anything. Facebook and any private sector company makes decisions about what information should be on their platform. Our point is that there is information that is leading to people not taking the vaccine, and people are dying as a result. And we have a responsibility as a public health matter to raise that issue. And the responsibility we all have, the government, media, platforms, public messengers, to give accurate information. Go ahead.
About the 12 individuals that are on that separate site. It's not from the White House. I don't have the source in front of me, but we've read it as well. Can you give us a sense of who those individuals are, as was asked before, and what specifically you've given a tough message to the social platforms that they should do more, the social media platforms. What from this podium is the message to those individuals, the 12 of them, who are responsible for 65% of the misinformation that's out there?
The message is the same message as it is to every person out there who has a platform, whether that is an elected official or that is a person who is a civic leader. The vaccines are safe, they are effective. If people take them, they will save their life in many cases. And so our message to everyone who's sharing misinformation is that the steps you're taking are irresponsible. They could lead to people getting very sick and people ultimately losing their lives. Why don't we all participate in a process that will help provide accurate information out there?
Has the White House participated in any direct contact with these individuals, given the impact they're having through any avenue to try to say, knock it off?
No, and I'm happy to get you guys the data on where we got that.
So that data actually came from this publication, which was done by the Center for Containing Digital Hate, CCDH, Center for Containing Digital Hate. It comes out of the UK, and it's titled The Disinformation Dozen, Why Platforms Must Act on 12 Leading Online Anti-Vaxxers. And then you have the executive summary there. It tells you all the problems. And then, we've got it gives their methodology, and then it identifies the 12 people which are on the list here, who you can see. If you want to zoom in on that, Brian, you can see who the people they say are the bad dozen people. And you can use that information accordingly. Look, this is, there's a thing called the Constitution, right of free speech. Government shall make no law, et cetera, et cetera. Government can't coerce things in the area of speech because government has, like big tanks and guns and nuclear weapons and that type of thing. So when they're doing that, that's a bad thing. Our founders said that was a bad thing. They asked, Politico did a Politico Live in the European Union this week. And here is a statement of a Facebook executive about free speech.
And what we're trying to find, of course, I think many of us who are engaging in this conversation, is that middle road. How do you moderate content? And how do you find that balance between human rights and free speech, which is a human rights, but also other human rights, because obviously free speech is not an absolute human right. It has to be balanced with other human rights. And that is what the oversight is there to do. Until now, we have seen content moderation, as I said, from a select few in Silicon Valley, and ultimately Mark Zuckerberg, who's been moderating content. Now we have the oversight board, which is a completely new invention to do this work. And of course, I want to say that I think this is a very, very positive new way of doing it.
Cool. Thank you. Comrade, thank you. Here's the president's view. Of course, now the White House got a lot of pushback on this, that you're censoring people, you're doing things that the government shouldn't do, you have tremendous power and intimidation. Well, we're just sitting around, the Biden White House with Susan Rice and other people deciding what to do, and It shouldn't be a problem. So now they've changed the message a bit. It's not, well, here's what the president said the message is at the White House the other day. Wait for it. Okay, he's going to speak.
They're killing people. I mean, it really, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated. And they're killing people.
Well, Facebook did not like this. Even Facebook said they're not the reason you missed the goal. Daniel Greenfield of Front Page Magazine has a very good article where he writes about this. And he says this: totalitarian regimes always use crisis claims to justify censorship. That's how tyranny works. But the question is, will judges, including the Supreme Court, who were hesitant to challenge the suspension of the First Amendment, such as the right to protest for Republicans, but not BLM Democrats, or freedom of religion over a crisis, agree that the lack of vaccination represents a public emergency that justifies government censorship? In 48 hours, the Biden White House has destroyed the myth that censorship is a decision by private companies. That will have lasting legal and political repercussions. He's exactly right. Here is a article in the New York Times this morning. Can Silicon Valley find God? This is, do you understand? Do you just like smack my head moments about 20 times a day now? This is like 1 week. This is this morning's news. Artificial intelligence promises to remake the world. These believers are fighting to make sure thousands of years of text and tradition find a place among the algorithms. Here is this is an interesting thing. So there's a book by Abigail Shrier called, here it is. It's called Irreversible Damage, the Transgender Craze of Seducing Our Daughters. That book was on the Booksellers Association, American Booksellers Association, ABA book, on their Twitter account. And I guess somebody woke up at ABA book and said, well, we can't say that. So they put out a thing, an anti-trans book that was included in our July mailing to members. This is a serious, violent incident that goes against ABA's ends, policies, values, and everything we believe in support. It is inexcusable. We apologize to our trans members and to the trans community for this terrible incident and the pain we caused them. We also apologize to the LGBTQIA community. Apologies are not enough. We've begun addressing this today and are committed to engaging in critical dialogue, indeed to inform concrete steps to address the harm we caused. Those steps will be shared in the next few weeks. So I thought, well, I want to get a copy of those tweets myself. So I went to the ABA book Twitter feed, and I came up with this. These tweets are protected. Please send us a follow request, and we'll decide whether you're going to be allowed to view the things that we're saying. So I did. Mine's still, you can see, well, it's still pending. We'll see how it goes. I'm not optimistic. But then I would look through the ABA book website, the American Booksellers Association website. Like, well, are they into censorship? Because this is what they're doing. They're taking down Abigail Shrier's great book, which gets, by the way, there's liberal people that love this book because it's so truthful about this problem. So I went to the ABA book website, which referred me to another website, and it has a page there. It's called Banned and Canceled Books. If you're able, please consider a donation to the Office for Intellectual Freedom to ensure that this work continues. What would I be? They really think we're stupid. You know that. I mean, and so then they have a list of the what do they call it here? The 10 most challenged books list of 2020. One of them is stamped, Racism, Anti-Racism, and You by Ibrahim Kendi, which is one of the big critical race theory books, although he acts like he doesn't even know what it means. Even though at other places he says, when he thinks it's a safe audience, it informs everything that I do. Here's another one, To Kill a Mockingbird. Here's another one of Mice and Men. The Hate You Give. And then they have like a conference coming up in a month or so, and it's called Banned Books Weeks. Banned Books Week. Books unite us, censorship divides us. And there's their page, the American Booksellers Association. But now they have blocked tweets, just like Pam and I had an apartment in our early marriage that had been occupied by somebody else, and there were a few, out of 1,000, 100 cockroaches running around. When you turn the lights on, they would scamper to the dark. And this brought back that memory when I saw this today, that they were protecting their tweets. They don't want to hold it up to the light of scrutiny. In this case, in the Eighth Circuit, the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship a few years ago sued the University of Iowa. That was because InterVarsity wanted people who had Christian values, would sign on to a statement of faith, to be involved in the leadership. The University of Iowa said, no, you cannot do that. You have to be open to everybody and tolerant of everybody. So they cut InterVarsity Fellowship off. Now, LGBT groups could require people to support the LGBT message to be involved in the leadership. And University of Iowa said, that's fine. That's great. Go ahead and do that. This is the middle of America. You know this, like this country we live in? Iowa's like right there almost, University of Iowa. And so InterVarsity Fellowship sued them. Eighth Circuit issued an opinion this week. We are hard pressed to find a clear example of viewpoint discrimination. Good for the Eighth Circuit. The district court said everything was okay. They appealed it to the Eighth Circuit. Eighth Circuit said, you're discriminating on the basis of viewpoint. It says here at the end, but as Justice Thomas asked in Hoggard versus Rhodes, why should university officers who have time to make calculated choices about enacting or enforcing unconstitutional policies receive the same protection as a police officer who makes a split-second decision to use force in a dangerous setting? What the university did here was clearly unconstitutional. It targeted religious groups for differential treatment under the human rights policy while carving out exemptions and ignoring other violative groups with missions they presumably supported. The university and individual defendants turned a blind eye to decades of First Amendment jurisprudence, or they proceeded full speed ahead knowing they were violating the law. Either way, qualified immunity provides no safe haven for these fascists at this university. I finished the sentence for them. That would have been in my brief, by the way, if I was representing InterVarsity. And by the way, the ultimate thrill for a lawyer that does an appellate case, when you're brief, you make some clever statement and it's quoted word for word in the opinion. That's a great day. That happened to me a couple times. And I love those courts that did that. Well, the FBI tweeted this week, family members and peers are often best positioned to witness signs of mobilization to violence, help prevent homegrown violent extremism. Visit gousa.gov and then this site to learn how to spot suspicious behaviors and report them to the FBI. This was tweeted on July 11th, last Sunday at 8 a.m. Somebody should have been watching Prophecy Update instead of tweeting this. And look at the picture. Do you see the picture here in the background? Here are some other pictures that were in the tweets. These are people, these are violent extremists. Well, then you go and you get the publication from about 2018 or 2019. It's Mobilization Indicators. And what you'll find is when you look through this, is that it's about a certain religion, violent extremists, and how they recruit online and that type of thing. But do you understand where we are right now is they are taking this document and saying it applies to people who support a political party that we don't like. This is what our government does. Breitbart reported this morning Capitol Police are to use the same surveillance equipment troops used against terrorists in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Capitol Police, which is, I thought, for the United States Capitol, located in Washington, D.C., the fence was removed, I believe, this week. They are now setting up field offices in San Francisco and Tampa with more to come. They are Capitol Police. Do you understand? We'll defund the police and we'll set up a police force, nationwide police force. This is very troubling stuff. They also removed in Charlottesville, they removed the Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee statues in Charlottesville, Virginia, where they had the protest. What they didn't tell anybody they were going to do, that they sort of did in secret, was they also removed this statue in Charlottesville. Now, why was this in Charlottesville? Who is this? And why would it have been in Charlottesville anyway? Well, the Louisiana Purchase was one of Thomas Jefferson's things, and the people who explored the Northwest part of the United States were guys named Lewis and Clark. And Lewis and Clark were assisted by an Indian woman, indigenous woman named Sacagawea. And so this statue was taken down because it said it showed Sacagawea in a subservient position to Lewis and Clark. Now listen, I went to school and I paid attention. I was never told this about Sacagawea. In fact, I was told that the Lewis and Clark expedition succeeded because of her great work. But this is what passes for thought police in America. Daniel Greenfield has another article, How the Air Force Academy Makes the Disloyal Military Leaders of Tomorrow. And then this week's critical race education update will be this. I think this lady was I think she's in the NAACP, in the PTA in Fairfax County, Virginia. And she says, we're going to stand up against these people who are trying to shut down this critical race theory. Listen to her words all the way to the end and try to make a list of all the people that she's against.
So let's meet and remain steadfast in speaking truth, tearing down double standards, and refuting double talk. Let's not allow any double downing on lies. Let's prepare our children for a world they deserve. Let's deny this off-key band of people that are anti-education, anti-teacher, anti-equity, anti-history, anti-racial reckoning, anti-opportunities, anti-health people, anti-diversity, anti-platform, anti-science, anti-change agent, anti-social justice, anti-healthcare, anti-worker, anti-LGBTQ+, anti-children, anti-healthcare, anti-worker, anti-environment, anti-emissions policy change, anti-inclusion, anti-live and let live people. Let them die. Don't let these uncomfortable people deter us from our bold march forward. Thank you.
Okay, so she was the here it says here, they've now requested and received the resignation of Michelle Leet, the group's vice president of training, the Virginia Parent-Teacher Association, which, by the way, in some other instances where the Parent-Teacher Association has been taken over through regular democratic business processes, they've taken over the Parent-Teacher Association. The response of the Virginia State PTA Association has been to decommission that particular PTA. I think that's happening in Loudoun County. Okay, so that's the upbeat part of my update today. There's a lot of things going on, so I'm going to do some things real quickly. U.S. and Japan are conducting war games amid China tensions over Taiwan. There was this report in a Denmark paper talking about preparing for a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. China Magazine published an article detailing a 3-stage attack on Taiwan, how they would go about it. In Israel, there was something that happened this is about a week ago. When there's a terrorist that's arrested or convicted in Israel that does an attack, what they do is they go in and destroy their home, the person's home. And the reason is this is the way you have to show that essentially that you're annihilating this person. It's very controversial. So Israel went in and destroyed the home of this terrorist. He killed somebody or a couple people. So what do you think? What do you think the Biden administration did? Bad Israel, you can't do that. That's disproportionate. Well, we do it because it works, so leave us alone. Even Israel Hayom, the left-wing magazine or newspaper this morning, they have a thing, devastation on a grand scale. Iran has had a lot of power problems. This was I don't know if I said this last week or not. I may have mentioned this, the doomsday clock till the destruction of Israel and Tehran. Because of the power outage, it went blank. So draw whatever conclusion you want there. Israel settlements are now considered to be, according to the UN Human Rights Council investigator, is called Israel settlements war crimes, and they should go back to the International Criminal Court. Just listen to what the guy says.
To you that Israel, the occupying power, has taken no steps to engage with my mandate, nor has it ever granted me access to visit the occupied Palestinian territory during my 5 years in this mandate. Access to Palestine is important to the fulfillment of my mandate, to be able to speak with human rights defenders directly, to be able to gauge the human rights trends on the ground, and to be able to hear all sides of those affected by the occupation. As I have previously stated, the refusal to cooperate with this mandate by the government of Israel is in no one's interests, and certainly not in the interests of the noble cause of human rights. Returning to my report, I would like to use a short time that I have today to address two important human rights issues related to Palestine. The first has to do with what has been happening recently on the ground in Palestine. Obviously, the most disturbing of recent events occurred in May, 2 months ago. In East Jerusalem, Israeli settler organizations sought to evict Palestinian families from their homes, primarily in the neighborhood.
A little bit. Here we go.
Gaza continues to suffer from a comprehensive 14-year-old blockade by Israel. The previous Secretary Generals of the United Nations have called collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. Excellencies, there is a straight line from the language in the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibiting settler implantation to the designation in the 1977 First Additional Protocol that this constitutes a grave breach of international law, to the determination by the UN Security Council that the Israeli settlements are a flagrant violation under international law, to the language in the Rome Statute that such settlements constitute a war crime. In all of these cornerstone instruments of international law on settler implantation, the language is virtually the same, the legal and moral purpose is the same.
Yeah, the usual stuff. Here's their report where they're talking about the violation, and the Israeli settlements are the engine of this forever occupation and amount to war crime. I've never been there. I've never seen it. I've never really got to investigate it, but I have a conclusion that this is a big, bad war crime. Somehow I think he was probably going to come to that conclusion regardless. Just an opinion of mine. So it goes on. We recommend the international community that it fully support the work of the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court as it investigates the allegation that the Israeli settlements are in breach of the Rome Statute. Here's an article from The Hill. Is Israel preparing for the inevitable war in a civil war in the West Bank between Hamas and Fatah parties? By the way, UN Watch said ahead of today's United Nations Human Rights Council's debate with its monitor on Palestinian rights, Michael Link, that's the guy you just saw, UN Watch released a report accusing him of systematically ignoring violations by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. Oops. Yep, he did. So good work for Halal Nauer of the UN Watch organization. We urge the mandate holder to acknowledge that if universal human rights standards are applied selectively and systematically denied to any class of people, they cease to be universal standards at all. Good for them. There's been a little bit of a dust-up in the arrangement between the UAE and the Israel on the Abraham Accords. And part of this was, remember I talked a few months ago about, maybe 2 months ago, about the Red pipeline that goes from Eilat at the southern end of Israel at the Red Sea with a pipeline across Israel up to Ashdod or Ashkelon, and I think there's a side pipeline up to Haifa. And so what they were going to do to avoid the, like a ship blocking the Suez Canal, like that could never happen, right? A ship blocking the Suez Canal. UAE thought, well, we want to get our oil to the to get it over Mediterranean, to get it over to Europe, and other points to the west. Like the United States and Canada or whoever needs it over there. And we need it now. We didn't used to, but now we need it because we've shut down a lot of our oil production. Don't know how that happened. So they have this pipeline that goes from the Red to the Med to the Red, and they would pipeline it across Israel, offload it on other ships. Now what happened was, so Lapid goes on his first foreign diplomatic trip. He goes to the UAE, and he doesn't meet with some of the important business leaders there. It was a bad diplomatic faux pas. The other thing that happened is one of the parties in the Israeli coalition is a really radical left-wing party, and the Minister of the Interior has said, we're shutting down the pipeline because pipelines are bad. I guess we'd rather truck it across a road. And have you ever seen some of the people, the way they drive on those roads down in the Negev in Israel? It's a little bit, it's scary. Okay, I mean, it's just scary. And so she says she wants to get rid of the oil transporting deal. Before this, she, by the way, was head of the animal rights lobby in Israel. So she's a radical leftist and environmentalist. She wants to do this, and so Caroline Glick has a good article on some of these crazy things that they're doing in the foreign policy aspect for with Israel. It just doesn't make any sense. There was also the other thing that was going on in the background. On Wednesday, Israel Hayom published an article by Benjamin Netanyahu, and it was titled, of course, he's the opposition leader now. That's how he's identified in the article. And it says, Iran is racing toward a nuclear bomb and the Lapid-Bennett government is silent. So he's concerned about what's happening. So he wrote this article. There was a response to that article by Danny Gantz, who's now the defense minister, like he was under the prior Netanyahu administration. And he says, oh, you can't say that, and you're going to upset the U.S. by saying this. So Netanyahu and Naftali Bennett really had it out on the floor of the Knesset. Now, I don't speak Hebrew, but I watched a little bit of their back and forth, and it was pretty entertaining. It was good television. You might look it up, and they were really going at each other. So Caroline writes an article in response to some of this nonsense, and she says this at the end. You can look it up at carolineglick.com. Under Lapid's stewardship, Israel's foreign policy isn't based on a strategy for advancing Israel's national interest. It is based on sucking up to the cool guys, the progressives in America, the jet setters in Brussels, and the Palestinians, with whom both the progressives and the Europeans view as their cause celeb. And it is based on joining them in bullying the unpopular guys, the Central Europeans, the anti-jihadist Arabs, and the Israelis, or in Lapid's case, the right religious bloc. Now, Lapid also went to Brussels, and he was really, as I think Caroline described it accurately, he was really kowtowing to the Europeans. And while he wouldn't say we support a two-state solution, it was pretty clear that he wanted to get in their good graces, just like you have this concerted push by the Obama administration to get in the good graces of Iran. More about that in just a moment. This is where Caroline says, this is where Bennett's temper tantrum against Netanyahu at the Knesset meets Lapid's upholding of optimism as the key to world peace. Both men see the world through the eyes of children. Bennett stars in the role of the rebellious teenager who despises his dad. Lapid is the social climber who builds his position by brown-nosing the football team. Unfortunately, as they play out their teenage fantasies together, neither Bennett nor Lapid is noticing that their interlocutors are not children. They are paying no attention to the interests and goals that motivate foreign powers, and they are unprepared to deal with the actual dangers rising against Israel from all quarters. Good article by Caroline. Now let me find the next article. There was something else in here that I wanted to show you. Well, there's a concern. There was this meeting between Egypt, Iraq, and Egypt in Baghdad recently, and they're calling this the New Levant Agreement. The purpose of the New Levant Initiative is to boost trade and security between Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan and work towards gradual economic integration between the three countries. I think this has huge prophetic implications. And you can see what they want to put together. The need to translate the strong strategic ties between the three countries into cooperation in vital sectors such as electricity interconnections. And the other thing that they're talking about is doing this pipeline across Jordan to Egypt. This pipeline is really something that will benefit Iran, because Iran is heavily involved in Iraq. So now there's a concern that Jordan is sort of tilting towards Iraq and Iran, actually tilting towards Iran. And it might be understandable. There was a court case in well, I don't see I have a slide on it someplace. There's the people that were involved in the coup in Jordan, just like a month ago? They've already been tried and convicted. Their justice system moves a little bit more quickly than the United States. Both of them were convicted. One was a former Saudi advisor, Alawad, I think is his name, very close to the royal family, and both Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia really intervened to try to get him off. He got a 15-year sentence, as did the other person who was convicted. The former crown prince, who he said he was sorry, so he got off. He didn't get tried or anything. This is a big problem. So Jordan appears to be tilting a little bit towards Iran right now. Part of that is because there's a belief that Mohammed bin Salman was behind the coup attempt in Jordan. So King Abdullah is a little bit upset. King Abdullah has opened Jordan to Iranian Shiite tourists. This is a very big deal. Jordan is a Sunni country. And so there's a lot of things going on here. This is the Levant. These are the countries, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. That's what's called, when you talk about the Levant. It also includes part of Turkey and Egypt. When you hear the Levant, that's the term. So the New Levant Initiative, it says, ironically excludes Syria, the historical heart of the Levant, or also known as Balad al-Sham. So, now, we did that one. This is Financial Times. They're saying Lapid presents a different Israel to the world. We got rid of nasty Netanyahu. We got rid of that nasty guy who used to be the president of the United States. And now everybody loves the United States again, and everybody loves Israel again. But why do they love him? Because I think they love him because they can push them around. There was one other article. This is a pretty important article that was in the Israel Hayom the other day. A document released by Iran Foreign Minister Zarif to Iranian organizations says that the U.S. has made certain concessions to USA in connection with the negotiations over the JCPOA. A couple of points. It may be that the Biden administration did actually make these concessions. It may also be that this is the way the Iranians negotiate, and they've released this document. Look at this agreement. This is what the U.S. is going to do. And the U.S. spends its time saying, no, we didn't do that. And everybody in the world thinks, well, look how reasonable these things are that the U.S. should do for Iran. Like, get rid of sanctions on the Ayatollah Khomeini. Get rid of sanctions on the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, because it's just a social organization in many respects. Just like Hamas in Gaza is largely a social organization, or Hezbollah is a social organization to these idiots. So that's going on. So this is a big deal. I have about 80 of these things that I'm trying to go through to. So the Gulf states, this is from the INSS, the Gulf states are changing their approach. Those that formerly supported the opposition to Assad are slowly drawing closer to the regime. Still, it may be an opportunity for Israel. They're talking about how Israel might benefit from this. The Saudis are kind of cozying up to Assad. It might benefit Israel in some regard. Don't know. There was a good article at understandingwar.org about the Russia-Turkey competition as of July 2021. And you see the different areas. You see Syria, you see Libya, you see the Caucasus. I talked a little bit about this week. You also see the Black Sea area. The Russian-Turkish relationship has become a defining driver of a conflict in a vast region from North Africa to Central Asia. This, I think, has implications on the Ezekiel 38-39 thing. This shows that they have an alliance, but they're not in agreement on everything. That's something to watch. Understandingwar.org is where you can find out more about that. Al Akbar in Lebanon had an article that talked about why isn't Mohammed bin Salman been officially named by King Salman as the successor? Is he going to make it? Is he not going to make it? Are things in turmoil there? There is some turmoil going on. You remember the big building in Dubai that's like half a mile high or over half a mile high? They were going to build one over 3,000 feet tall in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, there along the Red Sea. That thing's about 1/3 completed. I think it's like 230 meters high. And it's been stopped for like 5 years. It's just this big shell of a building sitting there because they arrested some of the people that were funding it. It'll be $1 billion loss if it doesn't get built. They're bringing back the Hajj this year on a limited basis. This is a current aerial view of the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Look at all the building, look at all the construction cranes and stuff and building that's going on. They're expanding this thing. See, a year ago, they expanded it or 2 years ago, by 300,000 square meters. That's a big addition. It used to accommodate 700,000 people at one time. The goal is to have it accommodate over 3 million at one time, and they're doing another expansion of 400,000 square meters. The building there that you look down on is the Royal Clock Tower. That's, I think, the third tallest building on the planet. To give you some perspective, it's the biggest hotel, highest hotel, and biggest shopping mall in the world right there in their religious place. So there's a couple developments that you should know about. This is an article, Iran's drone revolution takes off. This is from Haaretz magazine or newspaper this morning. And, you know, Iran's doing it because it's cheap. It's easy to control. But then at the same time, here's an article about Israel. Israel's taking drone fare one step further. Now, I want to remind you, this is the drone. It's kind of dark, but watch these are drones. This is the 70th anniversary of the founding of Israel in 2018. And what you'll see here is, you see, these are all drones. They're lit up, and they're going to form different things as they fly in the sky. Now, when this happened, I guess it's almost 3 years ago now, 3 years ago, it was pretty stunning. Like, man, how did they get all of those drones into that formation? So here you see the fig tree, You're going to see, I think you're going to see a windmill that's formed here that actually has, this is all drones controlled by computers. Hang on a second. Yeah, you see the windmill forming there on the right, and you actually see it rotating. It's pretty cool. And then you're going to see, the next one I think is you're going to see Israel 70 form. How far is this? Yeah, it should be just a few seconds here. And they're doing this at night too. You understand? Over a major city. I think this was done out at Mount Herzl. And you see the drones form the Star of David. And then they're going to form, back it out a little bit, they're going to form, I think, a 7. 0, here it comes. Anyway, so that's pretty cool, right? That's just like, oh yeah, that's a great celebration. Maybe we can do that in our backyard. But understand that what Israel has done now is they've taken that technology and they've adapted it into drone swarms to use in combat against people like Hamas. This is a very big development for Israel to do this. They face threats. Hariri has said he was supposed to form a government for the last year in Lebanon, and he said the other day, I'm done. I'm not going to do it anymore. Lebanon is falling apart. There is an excellent article in Friday's Jerusalem Post. Jonathan Spire, one of the best analysts on the Mideast, says this. This is the background to the current grave crisis in Lebanon. All the elements, U.S. sanctions, Saudi and international withdrawal of aid and investment, subsequent debt default and loss of confidence, resulting currency devaluation, a shadow economy benefiting only itself, and a paralyzed political system are all directly traceable to the distorting effect that the presence of the pervasive, Iranian project on Lebanese foreign soil has brought. From this point of view, the current situation stands as a stark warning to all countries faced with infiltration by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its various militia franchises. These are good at building paramilitary muscle and converting it into political power. They have no knowledge or interest in economics. As a result, the net outcome of their taking of de facto power in a country will be that country's eventual ruin and impoverishment. Lebanon is now the case study for this process. And the International Monetary Fund said, what's going on in Lebanon is one of the 3 worst economic crises in any country since 1850. That's pretty significant. And then I don't have time to get into Jonathan's article about Syria from a couple weeks ago. I also, as I get more information, I will talk a little bit about what's been going on in South Africa. It does seem like there's this, everywhere you look, something bad is happening. South Africa had a major meltdown this week, political crisis. This is from the London Times this morning. Orgy of looting and corruption has destroyed Mandela's dream. Friends have written to me and they say, well, on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the worst, it's a 5, maybe trending towards a 6. But they have gone into, this is not an atypical picture in some regions, they've gone into shopping malls and taken everything. I mean everything. They've trashed shopping centers. I have a dozen videos that a friend in South Africa sent me. I didn't even have time to edit them, where these people, these shop owners are crying, they've destroyed our lives. We will never recover from this. And all this was because a former leader got contempt of court. They put him in prison. And so what they did was they went to the gangs, this party, wanted to get them back in power. They wanted to create chaos. They went to the criminal gangs. They got certain supporters of the party to go looting. Hey, you can go get anything you want. Nobody's going to do anything. The hope was, I think, that the police would shoot them. Then they would have a political crisis. And yeah, but there were, almost 200 people killed in these riots in South Africa. This was not inconsequential. Johannesburg and some other areas, certain areas were just completely devastated. way worse than anything that happened in America. So that's happening. And then some good news, okay? Archaeological discoveries, and I don't have time to go into this. I'll do a midweek update and update you, but I think I'll just give you a flag it for you. Oh, here's that article about the conviction. Nope, that's not the right one. Never mind. Oh, well, this article too by Kochavi says that IDF Northern Command head Israel to pay, or Hezbollah to pay a heavy price in a future war. This 15-year anniversary of the Second Lebanon War. So there's quite an article. That's front page of Jerusalem Post either Friday or today. You might look that up. And then this 2,000-year-old coins hailing freedom of Zion and Jerusalem are uncovered in the West Bank. Here's what the coins look like. One dates to the Second Temple period. The other dates to the Bar Kokhba period in about 135 AD. And it's interesting because the Bar Kokhba period, they said, well, Israel didn't really control anything. The Jewish people didn't control anything outside of Jerusalem, up in the highlands, in the central highlands. But this is where they found them. There's a, hard to see here, in the upper, see that sort of orange dot in the upper center? There's the Dead Sea, there's the Jordan River to the right. Jerusalem is down here, lower left, and Ramallah is a little bit north of that. So it's up in it's in Samaria, and they found these coins that show Jewish thing. Now, of course, the response of Hamas has been Israel's falsifying Jerusalem history. They're making all this stuff up. They also found part of an ancient wall in Jerusalem, which was destroyed by the Babylonian army. Kind of verifying that. This is all happened. This is like 1 week. It's crazy. And then this article, front page of a section of the Israel Hayom this morning, which is an article titled 49 Cisterns Tell the Story of the Destruction of the Temple and Much More. This is Tish B'Av. This is the destruction of the temple. And what they found in the area around the Temple Mount, very not well known, but it's been leaking out over time. I guess you shouldn't use the term leaking and cisterns in the same sentence, but you get the irony of that. But they've discovered these cisterns are huge, as some people would say. These were to store water for the temple. I talked about this a little bit first hour today. This is a big deal. And I think this and the pilgrimage pathway sort of, to me, it's very damaging to the view that the temple was in the city of David. These cisterns were put here. You can drive through the hills down to Hebron, which is where one of the major water sources for the temple was, the first Solomon's temple and the second temple, and you can see the remnants of aqueducts on the wall, on the hillsides. So there were a lot of water brought to the Temple Mount because they needed a lot of water. And this is all around the Temple Mount, the existing Temple Mount, not in the city of David. So I just think I recommended that Biblical Research Associates, or whatever their name is, Scott Stripling and some other guys who do a great job. They did a 3-part series debunking the city of David view of the temple. And then this is kind of interesting. Israel quietly letting Jews pray on the Temple Mount and break with the status quo. That's reported on television in Israel. And they're having Jews go up on the Temple Mount and pray. This is a big deal. All these things are big deals that I talked about today. Attacks on freedom, censorship, which we know where that leads. Things going on in Israel, the Turkey-Russia relationship, the Iran-Turkey relationship, the Iran-Jordan relationship, the Israel, it's just all sort of coming together. It's just sort of like it's sort of a tsunami, I guess is the way you're looking at it. I can see it coming. I can see the white cap. Just don't know how long it's going to take to get here. But anyway, look, exciting times, right? If I gave my slide deck to somebody on this talk, they go, how do you do 130 slides in an hour and a half? And the answer is, I skipped 70 of them. That's how I do it. So listen, great times to be alive. We know that how this ends. Okay. In the meantime, as I talked about first hour, we have a mission to do. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for the instructions and guidance that you give to us, the confidence that we can live as people of truth in a world that doesn't care about truth. Give us courage to take a stand. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians 16, stand firm in the faith and act like men. Give us opportunities to be bold, truthful, wise as serpents, and harmless as doves. Give us opportunities to share the gospel. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.